breakout session on basic asphalt inspection. We appreciate having Chris Hall with us. He's a field engineer down in Ray Bentley's crew in St. George. He's a Southern University of Utah graduate. And we also have Braden Watson with us from CMT. He's a project manager there, and he manages the civil side of their work in highways and airports and such. Howard is handing out the sign-up sheets. Make sure if you need continuing education units, you sign up for those. That's how they're tracking them. If you're from out of state, we have another form that can be filled out that you can take with you. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris. Let's start out. Okay.
All right, both of us will be kind of presenting at the same time. We've just got mostly a slideshow of photos that we're just going to talk about. We're always welcome any discussion. If you see anything in the photo you want to talk about, bring it up because we're going to miss some stuff too. If I can get this. Where did my mouse go? How do you start the slideshow? Yeah. My mouse just stopped working. See the mouse on there? Sorry, I can't start the slideshow. My mouse is not working. Is there a reason why it's not displaying?
You know what? Just try closing it and opening it up.
My mouse is gone too.
You know what? Your screen's extended.
There we go. All right, sorry about that. So to kind of start off, how many people in here have inspected HMA before? Is there anybody that hasn't? Yeah. So we got a couple. So a lot of this is going to be renewed information for a lot of you. If you haven't inspected it before, go ahead and ask questions if we're going too fast or anything, slow us down. To start off with, some of the basic things that you need to know is that there's a lot of documentation, and a lot of it's just observation, because as an inspector, I'll just hold it. All right, sorry, I don't talk very loud. A lot of the documentation as an inspector of HMA is just observation and writing things down, because a lot of it, the acceptance and everything, happens in the lab from materials tests. So it can seem like a pretty tedious or boring job to inspect the HMA, but it's also very important because there's a lot of things you need to look for. That's why I put sampling testing down there, because there's usually two sides to it. There's people out there inspecting it. There's also people that are going to be testing it. Sometimes the person inspecting will also sample. Sometimes it's the people testing. You know, it kind of changes from crew to crew or how things work. And I also have the specification down there at the bottom. But as an inspector, you should be very familiar with the specification of what your limits are and what you can and can't do. And that's going to be a big part of our discussion today, is some of the limitations of the specification as far as inspecting the asphalt. All right. Just so you're aware, if you ever are inspecting it and you ever forget something or want a refresher course, if it's been a while since you've inspected the HMA, there's the UDOT Construction Inspection Guide. It's a great resource. There's actually a 12-minute video on there that covers some of the basics of it. But since there's so many people in here that have already inspected asphalt, I think I'm going to skip that video so we have more time to, maybe discuss some other topics. But just be aware of it's there. It's on the UDOT website. You can just search the inspector's guide. It'll pull it up. We have a whole bunch of different chapters on a whole bunch of different stuff. Jump in anytime you want to. So the documentation, here's some of the things one of the most important things that I think of is the collection and verification of delivery tickets. When the trucks come out to the job site, they're going to give you a ticket. It's going to let you know what mix it is, And I think that's the best place to document a lot of the things that you need to. You can see the list down here. One of the things that we like to document, and I like to write it on every ticket or every other ticket if you have the chance to, of the temperature of that truck. We don't want to get the temperature too hot because it can damage the binder if you come out too hot with your asphalt. An item number so we can pay for it. The time that the truck showed up. So that way you can see the time, because the ticket usually has the time that it was placed in the truck, and you can see how long it takes to get there to see if it is excessive time, to see if the asphalt had a chance to cool down. And that's another thing with the temperature, you can watch that. The location that it dumped. A lot of time this is passed over, but it's something that's a great idea to have on the ticket. So 2 lots later, you're wondering where something was dumped, or you notice a problem with the asphalt, you can go back and find exactly where that ticket was representative on the roadway. So if you got a station and offset on a ticket, you know exactly where that material was placed. If you're dealing with multiple lifts, you'll need to put the lift on there because you can have multiple station and offsets for different tickets depending on the day that it was placed. So put the lift on there if it's a multiple lift job. And also your production day or lot number. Any notes, and then initial or sign the tickets verifying that you were there and you were watched it placed on the job. And so that way we make sure we're paying for what was actually delivered to the job. Here's an example of a HMA ticket. As you can see that there's a couple things on there. Let me get my laser pointer out so I can kind of highlight what's going on here. You can see that the inspector signed it saying that it was actually delivered to the job. The item numbers was already printed on the ticket. As an inspector, you can check, yes, we are receiving HMA. And they usually will put your job number. And they'll often put the mix design number or what type of mix it is. And right here, I'm not seeing that it's a 1/2-inch mix, but that's something that they should put on there to verify that you're actually getting the mix that's specified to the project. But you can see that it was handwritten. You got a stationing, a little station range. You've got the time it was delivered at 8:58 and the temperature that he measured from that truck. So that truck was 305. That was what the asphalt temperature was. So here's a good example of just something that was quickly written on the ticket as they collected it to verify where it was placed, what time, temperature, and then he signed it saying, yes, this was actually delivered to the project. Here's another example. This is from an SMA. This is a little bit harder to read on the slide, but you can see that there's the description here. This says 1/2-inch SMA. Same thing, an item number. This one has a production day, the station and offset, 0 to 15 foot left, a temperature and a time. So this goes to show you that just a quick few notes on the ticket can give you a lot of information if there's ever questions later. Here's another example that I kind of labeled of everything that I talked about before. He's got the item number, production day. This one was interesting because he has got notes on here that he was going to get a way-back ticket because some of it was wasted. And then he put another note that said that the temperature was too low and it was causing problems. It was actually clogging the shuttle buggy and the paver, which was leaving some segregated spots and some bad spots in the asphalt. So they ended up wasting a lot of this truck and another truck. And he noted it on the ticket, so anybody that was reviewing the tickets would know that that's what happened there. And as you can see, the temperature, 260. So this is an SMA ticket. That's pretty low for SMA, and that's why it was clogging and having problems. So just looking at this ticket, you can tell if you ever went back to this job, you could look at it and go, oh, you know what, they had low temperature, they were having problems, and you can verify the tonnage of this ticket, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of verify that that's where that material was placed, and you could see that, you know, if there is a problem in the grade, that you can trace it back to exactly where it came from. This ticket actually came in with a picture showing that this is the pile of SMA that they wasted because it was cold. They cleaned out the shuttle buggy, they cleaned out the paver so they could start over. But he took a picture showing this is the quantity of material wasted. So if we didn't ever get a way-back ticket, we could quantify it and say this material is wasted. We can calculate basic yield off of how big the pile is and reduce that from their payment. Here's another example of something that's nice to have on the ticket. Up here at the top, there's the paving limits for the day. You know, from 526 plus 40 to 546 plus 70, 15 feet wide. so you have an idea of how many, and the inspector actually ran a yield or totaled the tickets, and then from there you can run a yield off of that, and you can compare if you're pretty close to how many tons that are supposed to have. So here's another idea of, you can put a lot of stuff on the tickets, all of it's useful, never feel like you're putting, you can always put as much information as you want on the ticket. The only thing I'd note on that is make sure you don't write over any of this material that's printed, because don't ever overwrite any information. You've got plenty of blank spots to write in here. Don't ever write over anything, to make sure you have all the important information if you ever need to go back to that ticket. So documentation. So when it comes to an inspector, you're going to have a lot of documentation. You're going to have your daily comments or your diary, and here are some of the things that should be included in that. You've got your documentation of your paver actions. Was the paver stopping and starting a lot? That can be an issue sometimes. So if there's lots of starts and stops of the paver, you probably document that. So if there is an issue, you can bring it up. Documentation of the tap application. Make sure that they're tacking the joints. Make sure they're tacking between every lift. And make sure that
And with the tack application, make sure that they let it sit a little long enough for that water that's mixed in there to start evaporating before they start paving over it.
make sure that tack breaks before they pave on top of it, and make sure that they've got a good application. It's not a spotty application. They've got the right application. Documentation of weather. If there's a chance of rain, make sure you document it. Document the ambient temperature, that sort of things on the weather. Documentation, the pavement locations and quantity. So rather than just on the tickets, it's good to have a backup of saying in your diary, they paved from a certain station to a certain station, and at the end of the day, the ticket's quantified to 2,000 ton or whatever it did. So that way there's another location that information is found rather than just on the tickets. Make sure you document any rejected trucks or material. If you have a truck that you rejected because you found a whole bunch of uncoated aggregate in it, make sure you document what truck number it is and the reason why you rejected that truck. Documentation of equipment used. You'll want to document what rollers, what kind of paver, everything that they use. So if you ever have a question, you can always go back and you can see exactly what the contractor used when they were placing that asphalt. Rolling patterns is a good thing to document. That's something as a UDOT inspector or a consultant inspector we often don't pay a lot of attention to, because usually it's the QC that's kind of taking over that and making sure that that's going well. I don't know if you have anything to include on.
So as he said, UDOT and QA usually doesn't have much to do with the rolling patterns. But as QA, you want to make sure that you know what the rolling pattern is, because it can vary. The mix changes, you're going to have to change it, and you want to make sure that the QC is up on that as well. You know how important a rolling pattern is, especially on the first day. Your gauge is running blind, you don't have an offset in there. You want to make sure that you're getting the most compaction you can until you can take a core real quick and get that dialed in. And then also you can figure out which types of rollers work the best with that mix. Sometimes you have to use a combination of double steel drum or pneumatic, or switch them between intermediate and finish rollers as well. Sometimes that'll give you a better compaction.
So it's just nice as an inspector to document those. If the rolling patterns changes, you can always go back and have that information if you need it. And then also document anything you observe. Oftentimes we get focused on just the bad stuff that we're seeing. It's always good to document the good things. Notice that they have good rolling practices. Document that. It's always good to document the good along with the bad. So if they're doing anything exceptional, make sure you document that too, because it's always good to do that. I briefly touched on yield earlier. As a department, we have this yield spreadsheet that's really easy to plug in. You can just type in the length of feet that was paved, your average width, your depth, and there's some adjustable numbers. If you're just doing a quick calculation, you can just use the average rice value from the previous day. If you really want to get right down to it, you can use the rice value for that day that after you get the results from the tests. And then you can just throw in your target compaction. And if there's any questions, you can always go back in once you get your compaction results and do your average compaction. And on this example here, the yield is saying you only needed 560 ton, but the tonnage from the tickets is 570. So it's a 25% overage. That can account to a huge amount of money. So if you ever, as an inspector, are questioning if they're using too much asphalt, it's always good at the first couple of days of the job to run these yields to make sure you're getting what you're paid for. And if you do notice something like this, ask the question, where's this other material going? You know, there's usually an explanation for it. They're usually too thick. You just put the lift thickness in, the average depth in wrong. So one thing you need to do is just do this to track down where these overages come from. Usually they come in pretty close and it's never an issue. Once again, observation. You just got to be looking. As an inspector, you should never be sitting in your truck. You should always be out watching what the paver's doing, collecting tickets. There's plenty of stuff for you to do. You know, watching the rolling patterns, watching the trucks dumping, make sure there's no big globs of asphalt that are getting stuck in the truck that continuously stay there round after round. Look for your unapproved release agents. A lot of times the pneumatic rollers will have a diesel in there to keep it from sticking to the tires. Watch for that, because I've actually been on a job where the pneumatic roller had it on continuously, and you could see that it was uncoating the aggregate for about a 100-foot section because they were putting too much release agent on there. It was just completely raveling the oil off of the aggregate. So just watch for those kind of things. Look for segregation in the material. Look for uncoated aggregate. Those things are pretty easy to spot if you're watching pretty close, and you can catch it early before it becomes a big problem. All right, we're into the pictures aspect of it. This is a picture of some guys string lining before they paved. Check the grade, make sure it's smooth, because that makes a big difference in how smooth your asphalt and everything goes.
All right, in this picture you can see how it is clearly kind of uneven. You want to make sure that, like you said, it's nice and smooth to pave on. In a couple slides, you'll see where they actually kind of, you know, they'll water the grade down to help it stick down to the soil. Also, you see them use tack coat on the, right on the road base as well. Also, he doesn't have any pictures in here, but when you're doing a mill and fill, if that mill doesn't consistently mill out, nice and flat, you're going to have spots where your compaction is going to be off because it's basically doing this underneath the asphalt. So it'll look pretty on top, but it's going to have a spot of compaction that's just not ever really going to come in.
So there's a lot of inspection even before they start placing HMA that you need to check. Make sure they got a good grade, nice and smooth. Here's another couple of pictures here. Up next to a bridge, up to your approach slab. You notice how they did a pretty good job of making that smooth. I've seen a lot rougher areas, and then you often end up with a big bump there if you don't have that nice and smooth, a good transition to tie into as you pave. Right here you can see they parked a water truck on the grade. You can't see it very well in the picture, but there was a little soft spot right there. I think they left it long enough it healed up before they paved, but there was still a little indent that may have caused a little dip or a little smoothness problem there. But that's something to watch for. They often get things prepped and then park things on it, like water trucks, and it can create a big problem when they pave, because if they parked a water truck there and didn't catch it, left it there for a couple of days, you could have a big soft spot there when they went to pave over it, and cause a lot of problem with the asphalt. So watch for certain things like that, little discrepancies. Make sure they don't park anything on the grade that could damage the grade before they pave.
And one more thing on soft spots. We just did a job recently in one of the cities here in the valley where there were fairly large patches, but around all the manholes, you can, after the asphalt was placed, after temperature was dropping, everything was coming in pretty well except for around the manholes. And the rollers would go over it, and you could just see it just still doing this after 2 hours. So it really kind of pays to drive a piece of equipment over it in those areas just to make sure that it is compacted, because sometimes they just don't, because of going up next to, box culverts, anything like that. They won't bring in any of their heavier equipment because it won't fit, obviously, but they need to put that compactive effort in there.
Here's an example of a water truck that was leaking. They parked it off the grade. I don't know if you can see very well. There's kind of a glare on there. there's a big puddle under the water truck. They parked it off the grade, so it wasn't a problem. But I put this slide in here as an example that water trucks often leak. If you park them on the grade, it can develop soft spots. So watch where they park their equipment. Here's a picture of a tacked edge. You can see that they did pretty good hitting the top. You see right along the bottom there that there's a little bit missed. I think it meets the specs. It only has to be a certain % coverage, but that's something to watch too when they tack the edges. Make sure they get the proper coverage. And also with edges like this, they often are dirty and they need to be swept before they're tacked to make sure that you get the proper adhesion there, or else it'll just delaminate because all the dirt in there. Here's another picture of a tacking area. It looked like they did that by hand, but it looks like they got good coverage. The only little spots you can see is where the truck went rolled over it, but that's going to happen no matter how you pave it. So here's a little picture of our but other times the tack truck driver doesn't even know that's going on. So if he wasn't overlapping right there, it'd leave a big bare spot for the tack. That's something to watch, and that happens often. You can clog those nozzles. They come in and out. So make sure the nozzles are clean on that tack truck. Make sure you get a good coverage. This is what we were talking about before. You often spray the grade with water to just wet it down and make sure that HMA doesn't move as much on you. It's a good practice. It's not required, but it usually helps the contractor out to spray it down. So if they're not spraying the grade down before they pave and they're having problems with it moving on them, it might be something you can suggest to help them out. Here's just a picture of a whole bunch of trucks lined up. When they start to pave, it's always good to have some trucks lined up so you have enough material to pull your run so you don't get a lot of those starts and stops. I put these pictures in there so you can visually see that as the dump truck dumps, you can kind of watch in there and make sure. I couldn't get good enough pictures to make sure that the bed was empty, but keep an eye on it because I have seen dump trucks that dumped that had big globs of asphalt stuck in the front. And so every time they made a run, we paid for about a half a ton that was stuck in the truck that continuously never came out. That also creates a problem if that did ever come out. That could cause a lot of problems for the contractor that could clog the shuttle buggy or the paver, depending on how they're placing it, if a big cold chunk of asphalt came out. So watch as they dump, make sure that all the material is coming out. Here's a little picture of something to watch for. It's hard to see in this picture, but right here, sometimes when they dump, material will fall out. If a lot of it falls out, it can cause problems because it can get underneath this ski and cause smoothness problems. So that's something to watch for also. Any excess asphalt that's coming out of there and getting underneath there. It can also get into the track and make the paver a little unlevel. It's not a big issue, but it can cause smoothness problems if it's constantly happening. It can make the paver go up and down. So watch if they're dumping. If they're getting a lot of asphalt under here, that could cause problems when they're dumping this way. Another application with belly dumps and a shuttle buggy. I just wanted to show you that that you got a good windrow there of a continuous that provides enough asphalt for the pavement pull.
All right, so here in this picture, you'll see that is that windrow nice and consistent. The speed of the truck's good. Got to make sure that the guy that is at the back of that truck telling the truck driver when to dump, that communication is really good. Go over a few slides. In a couple slides, you'll see one that looked like the truck moved too slow and just dumped a bunch of material down on the ground. Yeah, right here. That's especially towards the front of that shuttle buggy. It's just too wide, and now they're going to have to use the old Bobcat there to then scoop it, as you see here, and then move it down the line. That'll cause segregation. Also, if he's not careful, you're going to get some of the road base into the mix as well, causing problems. So you really want to make sure, and this goes for concrete as well. I've seen them do it with pavers. So got to make sure that that speed of that truck is nice and consistent, and the truck doesn't get stuck.
Yeah, so if you're watching this, just let them know if you see something like that. But I think we ended up making them waste some of this material, because as they scooped up this, they got a lot of dirt in it. There's a lot of dirty aggregate on there. It was coated with dirt, so it wasn't going to stick very well. So that's something you need to watch for as an inspector. If you see problems like this, sometimes you need to step in and do something about it. Just don't ignore it, because if we get a bunch of dirt on the HMA, it's not going to bond well, and it's not going to be a good product. There is some disadvantages here. If the shuttle buggy driver falls asleep, you can drive into a ditch. It took them quite a while to solve that problem. I think a lot of that, they had to waste a lot of the asphalt there because it cooled by the time they pulled that shuttle buggy out. Here is to say, this is the other thing that you need to watch with shuttle buggies. Sometimes they'll get too low and they'll start, you can see that there's a little bit of asphalt here, then a patch of dirt, and then more asphalt. But if they start lowering that head too low, they'll start picking up the untreated base from the grade. That you don't want that, you can have the same problem. You can have a bunch of dirt on your aggregate and your asphalt. So make sure you watch that, and make sure that if they're using that shuttle buggy, that they leave a few rocks there to make sure that you're not picking up dirt to mix into the rest of the asphalt.
Then on a sampling perspective, sampling with a shuttle buggy is a little bit more difficult than just with regular end dumps. You have to kind of prep the area because they already have asphalt placed. So then the technician has to scrape away whatever's lying there so his plate sits nice and flat on the ground. Because if not, it's going to be on top of, you know, a couple rocks here and there, and that's going to drag his plate even more, causing the sample just to be bad. And then also, that's really important, especially on a mill and fill with tack coat, because it's a lot harder to scrape all the stuff off that they've already placed. And so that technician, I mean, if you can slow him down just a little bit, it's very helpful, because that poor guy's out there just scraping his heart out trying to get that, you know, that flat spot where his plate's going to go.
Next couple pictures are just the paver. It shows that they can wing out to pave wider, that they've got a good head of material in there against there for the, make sure that they don't run out of materials, create a nice consistent mat. You can see here that you can look at that mat and you don't see any segregation. It's running great. If your mat behind the paver looks something like that, you should probably stop them and ask them why there's so much segregation. Just kind of, you can tell a huge difference between that picture and the last one. Watch for segregation. You can usually see it if it's going to be a problem. You can see the little screed lines there. They often will come out with the rollers, but all you got to do is just talk to that paving foreman. A quick adjustment of a knob takes care of that, and you end up with usually a little better product. So that's something to watch for if you have a bunch of lines like that and your asphalt looks like a joint, but a quick adjustment will fix that. All right. Interest of time, this is just a little video of rollers, but I think we'll just skip it. That once again, document the type of roller that they've got, number of passes, kind of their general rolling pattern. Another thing to watch for is that they have specific side slopes they have to meet. This one, they just broke the wing of the paver down and just paved that side slope in to meet the requirement in the detail in the plans. And then as you can see in this picture, they got a little steel drum roller to roll that edge to compact it. But there's multiple ways you can get that edge compacted, but they should be doing something with it. You can either break the wing on the paver and put that slope in there, or the next slide shows you that they can throw a shoe on the end of the paver to achieve that same results. You get that slope on there that's detailed in the plans, and then you should still roll it after that. More on rolling. You can see them starting to sample right there, but notice where the roller is. the breakdown roller is right up next to the paver. It should always be pretty close, or they're going to probably have troubles getting their compaction. As an inspector, like I said, you don't have a lot over the rolling patterns or any say over that. But if you ever start seeing these breakdown rollers getting 1,000 feet behind the paver, you should probably bring it up. Say something about it. It may just be a miscommunication between the paver operator and the QC or the roller operators. You might need to slow the paver up a little bit so they can catch up. But a quick word from an inspector can really help them on their compaction, because they may not realize that they're getting behind on the rolling patterns and that their asphalt's cooling. So if you notice something like that, it never hurts to bring it up to the contractor. You know, a little bit of conversation goes a long way to help them out.
Same thing. I mean, I see the breakdown rollers are usually pretty good about staying right up there. It's the intermediate, but mostly the finish roller that if someone's going to fall behind, it's going to be either one of those two. So make sure that just make sure that the QC technician and the roller hands are in constant communication. That's just the biggest problem that I've seen. And the QC tech gets behind. He'll tell the finish roller, hey, come back and hit this again real quick. Temperature's starting to go. Come back, hit this, hit this. And now you look at the paving train and they're just way up there. So just keep an eye out for that.
Here's just another picture of rollers. This is a different type of roller. That's a ham roller. I've only seen it on one or two jobs, but there are different types. Document what type they're using. Once again, these are the breakdowns, and you can kind of see in the background that you've got the other rollers back there, but these are your breakdowns. I put this picture in so you kind of see that, there's a little bit more difference between here. It's probably just the roller pattern. They're down here and they're going to pull up. But that's something to watch for. Watch where the rollers are in accordance to the paver to make sure that they're not getting too far behind. And give them a heads up if you notice that there might be a problem. This is something that I don't see very often, but it can be a problem. You can see where this roller is. He's not overlapping right here. He's right on the edge there, and if you can watch over here, this is the exact spot that he just rolled. You can see this little crack in it. If you ever see this, stop him. It can damage the asphalt on that joint. You'll never get compaction in that joint. If you ever see that roller doing that or see those cracks in the joint, bring it up. Let them know. Make sure they need to overlap that drum so it doesn't create that concentrated pressure from the steel drum to crack that edge of the asphalt. That is something you can stop them. If you see them damaging the pavement, as an inspector, stop them. Bring up the problem, make sure it gets fixed before it continues on and you have a whole job with a cracked joint like that. I showed a picture similar. This is on the other end, next to the asphalt, but this is just showing that if they pave up next to it, they rake it out, you can kind of see where they raked it, and it looked like it may be segregated, but after they rolled it, it looks pretty good. Just kind of watch them, make sure as they do that hand work tie-ins that they take good care and do good workmanship, and so that way you don't get a segregated spot as they come into those tie-in points.
All right, so we've all seen smaller jobs where around maybe curb and gutter, they'll use one of the vibratory plates. Job next to my house, they were doing a tie-in just like this, and they had a vibratory plate going in one of the actual driving lanes. Now, it's at the same depth as the rest of the pavement, and the rest of that pavement takes a much bigger machine to compact it, right? So when they run across that little joint, I watched them. I stopped and watched them. That's all they did right there. I'm pretty sure that didn't do much. So if you see something like that, make sure they put a little bit more effort into it.
Kind of the same thing here. You can see that a steel drum passed up as close as they could. And on this job, they actually took that small double drum steel roller that they were using to compact the edge slope, and they ran it transversely across here to get some compaction in there. They still left a little bit hump there. They probably came out and took it out later because I left before they were finished rolling. But that's just something to watch for. If you see that and you think they're going to be done, give them a little heads up. They can come in back in there with a finished roller and clean that up so there's not a bump there. But they should always have some sort of roller to compact that, especially up next to these structures and stuff. They should always get a roller on there to get some compaction in there. Yeah, if they're just going to use like a small vibratory plate, maybe bring it up, have them use a bigger piece of equipment to compact. I put this slide in here. You can see that it's a nice straight joint line. They've got some extra material there. Often contractors will come and rake that away. You don't want it. That's perfect. You want the extra material there, so when they roll it, it gets a good, nice, tight joint. If you see the contractor raking material away from a joint, bring it up. You probably don't want them to do that because it's not going to create enough asphalt in there to get a tight joint. But I just put this as a great example. They paved over the joint a little bit, so there's plenty of material there. They rolled it down, and it's a nice flush surface. Once again, you got some straight joint lines, which are great. They're easy to compact to. They provide a better finished product. Next slide here, you got some examples of some not so great joint lines. You can see in here that it's just wobbling in and out all through here. You can see that this is what they were paving up against. They had a hard time compacting this edge. In fact, they wanted to leave it like that. I had to remind them they needed to clean that out, all the dirt in there, clean it out and tack it. They wanted to just tack it and pave like that. It's something to watch for. Sometimes the contractors get in a hurry. They don't really mean to do stuff like this, but if you remind them, they'll take care of it. Once again, stuff to watch for. Make sure they clean that up. Make sure it's a big enough area they can get a roller in there to compact up to that joint. Make sure they cut it on a big enough angle that they can get a roller in there for compaction. We never want a joint paved up to a joint like that we can't get compaction in.
So I see this a lot on water line replacements where, and I'm not sure why, but their cut, all their saw cuts do this. You're not going to get compaction in those. It's just easy just to cut a nice straight line. And, in this example here, yeah, like you said, if you were to cut it back at an angle big enough to get, even a smaller roller in there, you'd be better off. There's a picture and a couple slides that is a perfect example. Oh, I guess it's a little ways, but basically it's just a smaller little V notch, and it's just not compacted at all. But we'll get to that a little later.
Same thing here. We try to avoid these little spots like this, but sometimes the design width requires it. But when they do pave like this, make sure they get something in there and clean it up so you have a nice straight line to pave to when they come back through for the other pass. Here's where we want to bring up some of the specs. This right here, you can see all the cracking in it, but all the testing shows that this mix is in bonus. So the spec doesn't address, if there's problems like this, what to do with it. And that's one of the big things I want to, as more slides go on, there's more problems like this. You can see this visual deformation or problem in it. It's got some micro cracking. Eventually that's probably going to reflect up through. It's not going to provide the same lifespan as a regular pavement, in my opinion. And so you can be a problem with it. So watch for that. Sometimes this can be corrected, so maybe sometimes it's the shipment of oil. It might be the rolling temperature that they're rolling it at. There's multiple reasons that could cause this. If you see it, bring it up, and maybe the contractor can do something to help it out. Another slide of the same thing. This one's I pulled off the internet, but that other one was off a job that I was on. The next thing I kind of want to talk about is temperature. It's pretty critical. Here's an example that I pulled off of the UDOT website that has different grades of oils and their mixing and compacting temperature. I kind of blew it up so you could read it a little bit better. It's still probably hard to read for you guys in that back there. But you can, when you look at the mix design before you start a job, pay attention to this. Go find your grade of oil, find what your mixing temperature is, what your compaction temperature is, and kind of pay attention. If you got a compaction temperature at 310 to 295 and they're barely getting their breakdowns on it when it's 260, you might want to bring up you may have a compaction problem. The other thing to watch is make sure that they stay within this range when they're delivering it to the job. Once you start going over this range by much, you start damaging the polymers in the oil, and you may not be able to see the smoke, or you may not be able to notice it, but there's a good chance that you won't get the lifespan out of that asphalt if you heat it over these mixing temperatures, because it can damage the polymers in the oil. So that's the biggest reason why we want to check that temperature on as many trucks as you can that are coming out to the job to make sure that we're not exceeding these mixing temperatures. Here's another sheet of the same thing. This is off the UDOT website too. This is by supplier. This one also says if it's approved or not. I think this is an older spreadsheet, but same thing here. It gives you the asphalt supplier, your grade, your mixing temperature, your gyratory temperature. But anyways, it gives you all those temperatures to watch for. So you can do this by supplier and by grade of oil that's being used. Get those temperatures. Make sure the contractor knows not to overheat it. Let them know that if you get stuff that's going to be over those temperatures, that you're going to start rejecting trucks. If they start creeping up on that temperature as you're taking them, let the contractor know. Give them a chance to fix it, and then you'll probably end up with a better product. You're not going to have any damaged polymers in the oil because you overheated it. There's multiple ways you can get the temperature. If they're using belly dumps, using just a probe, you can stick it in there and get a good temperature. Sometimes with those probes, you'll have to stick it in a couple of times to get the probe hot before it'll read the correct temperature. Same thing here. That's an infrared gun. He's just watching as it is dumping out of the truck. The infrared works best if the asphalt's moving. So get it when they're dumping it or some other way, and you can get a good reading with the infrared gun.
This is what I was talking about, this patch. This is ridiculous. If they were just to fade that back just enough to even just get a small, just the edge of a small roller in there, I mean, even that truck could have done a better job at compacting that. Looks like they have a little lack of tack coat as well, but it's kind of their least of their worries on this. So in the next slide, obviously it was removed.
We notified the contractor. We notified the contractor, and this is what they ended up having to do to get that fixed. We made them rotomill a straight line. Now there's still, you can see the rotomill teeth here. This just kind of raveled off because there was no compaction right there. There was just what the paver put out. So that's probably compacted right around 80%. So there's really nothing there. So we really needed to take care of this beforehand, but at least this gave us a good surface to put the SMA on top of to help correct this problem with compaction in this little spot. Right here. This, I believe, was a 3-inch lift design. Where this crack is, the asphalt was probably 2.5 inches thick. That night before we left, you could see a crack there, but overnight as it sat, that crack developed. This production day was actually in reject. I can't remember if it was for gradation or binder content. So we ended up getting them to remove this area, but the contractor didn't even want to remove it after that. We had to fight him to get him to remove this. That was the big issue I have with the spec. If all 4 tests show that you're in bonus for this, there's no way by specification that we can get them to remove this, and we're stuck either accepting this or paying them to remove it and replace it, because there's no mention in the spec of any visual problems with the asphalt or any workmanship problems. All of our acceptance is based off of 4 random tests. So that's a big issue that I want to bring up and make aware that there's probably something that needs to be fixed in the spec. Has anybody else had any problems with like this in the past, where you have passing test results but workmanship that probably shouldn't be left on a job? Nobody wants to share? All right, we'll keep going. Same thing there. Starting to get cracking right there. I believe this was left in place. This was on a shoulder, so it's not quite as critical. But this one out here was in the middle of the road here, and I believe we ended up just paying for it because their tests said it was acceptable, and there was nothing we could do about it. Same thing here. Some odd things going on. The asphalt lifted after they were paved. Don't know what happened there or if it's going to cause any long-term effects, but once again, the specification doesn't address how to deal with something like that. Right there, this one's harder to see. You can kind of see that's about what that crack looked like, but it was all the way up in the center. This is the joint line, so it wasn't on a joint line. This is right in the center of the pavement mat. They actually paved this first. They had 2 confined edges. So I don't know what happened there to cause this, but that is still there today. They had passing results. There was no way we could reject that. We had to accept it with a big crack down the middle of the road. That was paved over the top of, and that's where we left it because the specifications didn't address anything that way. Same thing here, segregation. This one's really easy to notice. Nice big segregated spot. Once again, unless we happen to have a random sample land in that segregated spot, it's going to show their asphalt some bonus or great material. And we have no way of addressing that this is going to be a future maintenance problem that starts to ravel out. This little segregated spot's a little bit harder to notice, but you can kind of see it right through there that you've got some segregation. Now, I'm not saying if you see segregation it should immediately be rejected, but if you've got a lot of segregation like this, a continuous problem, because you're often going to get little small patches, and it's not a big thing of concern, but just watch for big long ones that should be addressed.
Other points of segregation you're going to notice is you're going to have a guy behind the paver on that edge. He basically squares up the edge and then he rakes across the excess material. Sometimes they get a little too crazy on doing that, and you end up with just larger rock over the top. Also, where they pull a sample, you're going to notice a little rectangular spot there. So a lot of contractors are good about getting that patched in right away, and so their breakdown roller can get on that. But sometimes they'll just get stuff off of the wing of the paver where it's already segregated, and they'll just put that in the hole.
With a lot of these issues, if you bring it up before they're done paving, bring it up as soon as you see it, the contractor will often take steps to try and fix it, and we're not stuck paying for something after the fact that the specification doesn't allow us to do anything about. So that's why we're bringing this up. If you're an inspector and you see some of this stuff, bring it up, have the discussion. It can and probably will be fixed, and we won't be stuck with a product that we don't want if we bring it up early enough. Right through here, it's a little bit low through there, slightly segregated, but I was walking around taking pictures, I stepped on it, and I felt it move. They were kind of in a taper right here, in the end of a taper, so it wasn't that thick, but there was a soft spot underneath there that you could feel it. So as you're walking around, pay attention. You can feel some of those areas, but there's a little bit of a soft spot there. It's probably why you can see that dump truck or the backhoe track is probably because it was moving a little bit. Anyways, you can feel it as you're walking around. Just pay attention as you're walking around the job. This right here, they saved a little bit in the truck to make a little ramp for the paver, and it worked great. They paved up to it, didn't damage that edge, but when they backed the paver off to back up to do their next run, they didn't make a ramp, and you can see that it busted out that edge a little bit. And if you ever see that happen, I mean, this is not ideal because it's not going to create a good joint there. But if they do that, make sure they re-tack it, because now that piece that was there doesn't have any tack on it, and it's already a weak spot in the joint. Make sure they re-tack that if that does happen. Moving on to cores. How you fill them and compact them makes a big difference. Those cores started to ravel after one day of traffic on it. We painted them out for the contractor to fix. But imagine if those were left for multiple days, or if that was the top lift. You can see that this can be a weak spot in the pavement. When you're watching cores, make sure they're compacted properly. And that was another, I was going to say that was another thing I'd like to add to the specification is require tack in there to make sure that stays in a little bit better. Right now, there's really no specification other than that has to be a high oil content cold mix or a HMA. But every time I've noticed they use a high oil content cold mix, they ravel. It never works as well, and so it might be beneficial to require tack and require HMA or SMA to fill the core holes and don't allow the cold mix. But I've noticed that there's a whole bunch of pictures in here of this happening.
So as someone who's done hundreds of cores, it is usually always at the end of the day. And paving, depending on the job, can go anywhere from 8 hours to 16 hours. And you're on a 16-hour day, that's the last thing you have to do before you get to go home. You rush through it a little bit. However, you get your hot mix off the last couple loads of of whatever's coming, and then it sits in a cooler, hopefully, until all the rolling operations have stopped, and then now you got to wait for the temperature to drop before you core, and so that asphalt's just sitting, and even though it's in a cooler, it's cooling down. So in a couple more slides, you'll see it is. I think a close up of these ones. That right there, that is cold. That is bottom of the bucket. It's probably the last of the cores. That's cold. That's not a great patch job at all. And then also make sure that they're using the correct equipment. I have seen sledgehammers. I have seen sticks being used. But I know that my company, a lot of companies around here will use a Marshall hammer. That's usually the most common to refill it. And make sure that they do it in multiple lifts. And then also, I haven't seen it much, but I know they have like almost looks like a little table hockey puck you put in there and you hit it with a hammer. But I've only seen, I know we have one, but it sits in our lab as a paperweight. So just because that's how much fun they are to use. And then yeah, cold mix, never use it. It's always best just to use a hot mix. You can get it, you can stop by any hot plant. They'll just give you some, pretty sure.
So cores are a big item. They can be potential potholes in the road. So make sure that they're filled right, not using, cold HMA. They can be potential problems. So it should be a high priority on your list as you're inspecting the HMA. This was a gem. I told them they had to have the core holes filled before they switched traffic over, so they filled them with untreated. And as you can see, after even half a day of traffic, they're starting to ravel. I had to dig it out. I made them tack it because the sides were dirty, and then refill them back in with the HMA. You can see that it was in live traffic, right on a wheel path almost. Just more pictures of some core holes that you can see the before and after. Just make sure they take care and compact, like you said, multiple lifts with the right equipment, Marshall hammer, something else that will give some compaction to that material in that hole. The other thing to watch for is if they fill them right after they core them, there's often water around. Whether they use a vacuum or a sponge, make sure they clean out that water and make sure you have a good clean area to put your material in, or else you can have that problem of just raveling right out if there's nothing for it to stick to, if it's all wet and dirty. So make sure they put a little bit of effort into cleaning out the core holes before they patch them. All right, this is a picture. A lot of sampling. They just take the sample. Down in Region 4, we often split it on site. That way we get, it's nice and hot. We have the right sample size as soon as we get back to the lab. It's pretty easy to do. I know a lot of people just take the sample, take it back to the lab, and have them split it down. You can see that they've got it's hard to see right there, but behind him is a little riffle splitter. They got all the pans right there. This way we know that the pans for the sample are always clean. Oftentimes when they take the sample and just throw it in a 5-gallon bucket, it's been used on the past 3 jobs and hasn't been cleaned out, so who knows what's in that sample or in that bucket that could cause problems with the sample. He's right there waiting for the paver to go over it. He's got the plate there you can't really see, but he's holding on to it. If you notice, he made sure that it was on a clean spot. If you ever are going to sample the asphalt, make sure your plate's on a clean spot. You don't want to set it on anything like that because the plate can move and cause problems. It can even get sucked up into the augers of the paver. Not a good idea. Make sure it's on a clean spot if you're going to throw that plate and sample. After the paver passes, pull up your plate, take your shovel full. They take it back, and right there you can see them just splitting it down. Splitting it twice if you get the right size of shovel gives you a perfect rice burn-off sample size. Right here we took a picture of this. You can see that they made sure that they took care in replacing that sample area. They put some buckets there. He raked it out. After the rollers passed over this spot, if you went back an hour later, you couldn't tell that they sampled there. Great job in raking it out. Make sure there's not a segregated spot where we sampled. How much time do we have? 5 minutes. We're basically over. This is a couple-minute video of them sampling, but I don't think we need to show it. I think most everybody in here has some experience there. Anyways, if you are going to sample, make sure you refresh. Watch that video on the UDOT Inspector's Guide. It gives you a good overview. And do we have any questions? All right, guess you get out 5 minutes. Oh, Howard's got one. In what slide? That was before we were pair teed. That was while we were pair teeing, so we took the course together. When we first started it, often, but recently I've noticed that it was separated and they weren't right next to each other.
So most contractors that are actually doing the testing, I know Staker, Geneva, Granite, and Kilgore also, they take it almost every time right next to UDOT because they want to know what they're getting right away instead of having to wait till the next day. Where if you were doing it in a different function, taking 10 random cores all by themselves just to see what the mat's doing. However, they are more concerned with what you guys are getting. So that's why they do it. Any other thoughts on it? Yeah.
But yeah, recently they've been sampling separate from ours after we pair teed. We've noticed that they've been doing well.